The folly began in the driest summer anyone could remember. It started not with a bang, but with the quiet, rhythmic scrape of a saw against stubborn pine, a sound that carried for miles in the dead still air of the valley. On the long, sloping ridge that overlooked the town of Providence, a single figure toiled under the oppressive weight of a bleached white sky. His name was Abner, a rancher whose land had gone to dust, and whose cattle had been sold off for a pittance months before. While other men sat on their porches conserving their energy, their gazes fixed on the merciless sun, Abner worked. He was building something vast and nonsensical, a structure whose skeletal ribs rose against the horizon like the carcass of some long-extinct beast. To the people below, squinting up from the single dusty street that comprised their world, it looked like a boat. A boat, here, hundreds of miles from the nearest significant body of water, in a valley where the river had shrunk to a muddy brown thread, and the wells were beginning to cough up grit. The laughter started in the saloon, a low rumble of disbelief that grew into a daily chorus of mockery. He was called a fool, a madman, a man whose mind had been baked dry by the relentless heat. Children would dare each other to run up the ridge and shout jests at the silent, sun-weathered figure, whose only response was the steady, maddening beat of his hammer. The structure grew with an unnerving speed. Great lengths of timber, bought with the last of his money, and hauled by mule from the mountains, were being shaped and joined into a hull of impossible proportions. It had no keel to speak of, for it was not being built to sail but to sit, a great flat-bottomed barge designed for stability. The people watched this progress not with admiration for the labor, but with a deepening scorn. His madness, it seemed, was as boundless as the arid plains around them. It was an affront to their own quiet suffering, a monument to one man's spectacular loss of reason. A passing farmer, leading a weary horse toward what little water remained in the communal trough, paused one afternoon at the base of the ridge. "What is it you're building up there, Abner?" he called out, his voice laced with the exhausted irony that had become the valley's primary currency. Abner paused, wiped a line of sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, and looked down. His reply was simple, unadorned, and utterly insane. "It's for the rain." The farmer let out a short, harsh laugh that turned into a cough in the dusty air. "What rain, Abner? The sky's been wrung dry for a year." Abner offered no further explanation. He simply turned back to his work, and the sound of his hammer resumed its lonely, rhythmic beat, a sound that defined the man, isolated, relentless, and deaf to the logic of the world below. The whispers in town coalesced into a shared, communal narrative. Abner's folly, as it was now universally known, became a landmark of derision, a fixed point against which the townspeople could measure their own sanity. In the dim, fly-buzzed interior of the general store, conversations would halt as the distant rhythmic pounding drifted through the open door. It was a sound that grated on their nerves, a reminder of the heat, the dust, and the man on the hill who seemed to be mocking their pragmatism with his fantastical labor. The consensus was that something had to be done, not out of malice, but out of a sense of civic duty. The man was a danger to himself, squandering his last resources on a delusion. This responsibility fell, as most difficult things did, to Marshall Tate. He was a man carved from the same hard earth as the valley itself, practical, measured, and with little patience for anything that strayed from the predictable order of seasons and scents. He saddled his horse one sweltering afternoon, the leather creaking in protest, and began the slow ride up the dusty track to the ridge. From a distance, the scale of the project was impressive. Up close, it was overwhelming. The structure towered over him, its raw pine timbers smelling of resin and heat. It was less a boat and more a floating barn, a colossal utilitarian box that blocked out a significant portion of the sky. Abner was planing a long plank, his movements economical and focused. He did not seem surprised to see the marshal. "Tate," he said, by way of greeting, not pausing his work. "Abner," the marshal replied, swinging down from his horse. He stood for a moment, taking in the sheer, stubborn reality of the thing. "The town's worried about you." Abner stopped his plane and looked at the marshal. His eyes were clear, not the wild, frantic eyes of a madman. They were just tired and patient. "I'm fine." "You're building a boat on a dry patch of land in the middle of a drought that's crippled this entire territory," Tate stated, letting the facts hang in the air. "I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" the marshal pressed, his voice even. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks like the work of a man who's been out in the sun too long. People are struggling, Abner. They see this, and they see waste. They see a man who has given up on reality." Abner finally set his tool down and walked to the edge of his creation, looking down at the valley spread below, a tapestry of brown and beige, shimmering under the heat. "This valley," he said, his voice quiet but resonant, "is a cup, and a cup is meant to be filled." The marshal shook his head slowly. "The river is all but gone. The sky is empty. What's going to fill it?" Abner turned his gaze from the valley to the cloudless expanse above. "The water will come from above and below. Marshal, it will come all at once." It was the quiet certainty in his voice that was the most unsettling part. He spoke not with the fever of a lunatic, but with the calm conviction of a man stating a simple, observable truth. Tate left with no resolution, the sound of Abner's hammer resuming before he was even halfway down the ridge, each strike a beat in a countdown only one man seemed to hear. The change, when it came, was not in the sky, but in the air itself. A strange oppressive humidity began to settle over the valley, a wet, heavy blanket that made the heat even more unbearable. It was a dampness without a source, clinging to the skin and making every breath feel thick and warm. The people of Providence, accustomed to the clean, dry air of the plains, found it deeply unsettling. They'd mutter about it on their porches, fanning themselves with little effect, blaming it on some distant, stagnant weather pattern. A heat dome, they called it, a new term for a new kind of misery. Then the animals grew restless. Horses in their corrals would shy at nothing, their eyes wide and white. Cattle stood clustered together, facing the high mountains to the east, lowing mournfully into the suffocating stillness. Martha, the baker's wife, found her chickens in a state of silent panic. "They won't roost," she told her husband, her voice a worried whisper as they stood by the coop in the strange yellow twilight. "They just pace and stare at the hills. They haven't laid an egg in 3 days." Her husband, a man who trusted bread and heat and little else, dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "They're just as thirsty as we are, is all. Don't go getting fanciful." But the signs were becoming harder to ignore. The birds that should have long since departed for cooler climes remained, circling in vast, silent flocks high overhead, their patterns erratic and strange. Down at the riverbed, the thin trickle of water that remained seemed to darken, and the air around it carried a new smell, not of life-giving water, but of deep, disturbed earth, of mud and decay. Up on the ridge, the nature of Abner's work changed as well. The rhythmic hammering ceased, replaced by a slower, more deliberate process. He was sealing the great hull, melting down barrels of pitch over open fires, and slathering the thick, black, funereal substance into every seam and joint. The acrid smoke drifted down into the valley, an unpleasant chemical smell that added to the general sense of unease. Then he began gathering his own few remaining animals, a pair of sturdy mules, his milk cow and her calf, a handful of goats, and his loyal dog. He did not put them on the great structure yet, but moved them into a large, well-stocked corral he had built near its base. This act, more than any other, was seen as the final, irrevocable proof of his madness. He was no longer just building a folly. He was playing out a biblical fantasy, and the townspeople watched this final, bizarre chapter of his delusion with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination, reassuring themselves that the world they knew, the solid, dusty, predictable world, was the only one that was real. The sky began to curdle. For months it had been a uniform, indifferent canvas of pale, washed-out blue. Now, a strange, sickly, yellowish gray stain appeared on the eastern horizon, spreading not like a weather front but like a bruise. The wind, which had been a constant hot breath for as long as anyone could remember, died completely. The silence it left behind was absolute and suffocating, broken only by the nervous coughing of men and the distant, troubled lowing of cattle. A profound stillness settled over Providence, a held breath that made the world feel fragile, as if it were a pane of glass about to shatter. Then came the sound, or rather, the feeling. It was a low, persistent thrumming that seemed to vibrate up from the soles of their feet, a bass note so deep it was felt in the chest cavity more than heard with the ears. It was not thunder. It was too constant, too resonant, like the groan of the earth itself. People drifted out of their shops and homes, their faces tilted upward. The laughter about Abner's folly had vanished from their lips, replaced by a tight, anxious line. They saw storms. They knew storms, but this was something else entirely. This felt ancient, elemental, a force gathering itself with a terrifying patience. The first drops of rain did not bring relief. They were fat, heavy, and lukewarm, striking the baked dust with a sound like spattering grease. They left dark coin-sized circles in the powder-fine dirt of the main street, each one an omen. The air grew thick with the smell of petrichor, the scent of a thirsty earth receiving water, but it was mingled with the deeper, more unsettling scent of the disturbed riverbed. Up on the ridge, Abner worked with a calm, deliberate urgency. The great ramp of his vessel was down. Against the backdrop of the bruised sky, his silhouette was clear as he led his animals from the corral and up into the cavernous hull. He moved without haste, his actions precise and certain. He did not look down at the town, did not seem to register the figures standing frozen in the street below. His focus was singular, his purpose absolute. Marshal Tate stood on the covered porch of his office, his hand resting on the smooth-worn wood of a support post. He watched the sky, his pragmatic mind struggling to categorize what he was seeing, and failing. His deputy came to stand beside him, a young man whose face was pale with a fear he didn't understand. "What do you make of it, Marshal?" the deputy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tate didn't take his eyes off the unnatural color spreading across the sky. He thought of Abner's words, of the quiet, unshakable conviction in the man's eyes. The folly on the hill no longer seemed like madness. It now seemed like the only sane thing in the entire valley. He let out a slow breath. "I make of it," he said, his voice low and heavy with a dawning dread, "that we should have listened. The rain did not fall. It was unleashed. The fat, sporadic drops became a thick, continuous roar, a deafening curtain of water that blurred the world into a churning gray chaos. It was not a storm that would pass. This was a deluge, a relentless vertical river pouring from the bruised belly of the sky. The sound was overwhelming, a constant percussive drumming on every roof, a hissing torrent in the streets, and underneath it all, the deep, terrifying rumble that had preceded it all, now growing into a ground-shaking roar. The unique geography of the valley, a fact known to all but understood by none, now became its doom. It was a natural basin, a massive cup rimmed by jagged mountains and fed by a network of dozens of canyons and dry ravines. Every drop of water that struck the hardened earth of those surrounding hills for 100 square miles was now being funneled with terrifying efficiency toward one central point, Providence. The river, which had been a dying trickle hours before, was the first to transform. It swelled with impossible speed, its muddy banks dissolving as it became a churning brown monster, swallowing the cottonwoods that lined its path and disgorging them as battering rams. The water spilled into the low-lying fields first, then began its inexorable creep up the main street. Panic, cold and sharp, finally shattered the town's stunned disbelief. People scrambled, not to escape, but to save things. A sack of flour from a storeroom, a horse from a stable. But there was no time. The water rose faster than a man could run, swirling around ankles, then knees, then waists, its current growing stronger with every passing minute, thick with mud and debris. From the ridge, the spectacle was both terrible and grand. Abner had raised the ramp and sealed the great door. His structure, the product of a season of ridicule, began to groan under the strain as the ground beneath it turned to slurry. The rising water licked at its flat-bottomed hull, and then, with a deep, resonant shudder that traveled through the very timbers, The massive vessel lifted. It swayed once, twice, and then found its equilibrium, floating free upon the churning brown lake that had once been a valley. It was real. Abner's Folly, the great joke, was an ark, and it was the only thing left that was solid. Down below, Marshal Tate saw the livery stable collapse, its walls giving way with a sickening crunch. He knew the town was lost. His own office was already waist-deep in the foul-smelling water. There was only one direction to go. "To the ridge," he bellowed, his voice raw against the roar of the flood. "Everyone, get to the high ground, to Abner's Folly." He grabbed the arm of the baker's wife, pulling her from her flooded home, and began to lead a desperate, terrified procession. They abandoned everything, their entire world sinking beneath the waves, and fought their way through the deepening, treacherous current, their eyes fixed on the impossible silhouette of the floating vessel, a symbol of a salvation they had so arrogantly mocked. The climb was a nightmare ascent through a world dissolving into liquid chaos. The slope of the ridge, once a gentle, dusty incline, had become a treacherous waterfall of mud and rock. The water surged around their legs, pulling with a malevolent, unseen strength, threatening to sweep them back into the churning cauldron that was once their town. Each step was a battle against the current and the slick, uncertain ground. Marshal Tate was at the front, his face a mask of grim determination, bellowing encouragement that was mostly lost in the roar of the deluge. He hauled the baker's wife, Martha, behind him, her face a pale blur of terror. Others followed, a ragged chain of humanity linked by desperation. They saw things in the water that would haunt their sleep for years, a child's wooden toy spinning in an eddy, the splintered sign from the general store, the bloated carcass of a horse turning slowly in the current. The flood was not just water. It was the liquefied memory of their lives being torn apart and washed away. They slipped, they fell, they were dragged forward by their neighbors. The air was cold, but the exertion made them sweat, the rain plastering their hair to their skulls. Above them, impossibly, the great dark shape of the ark was a promise. It floated with an unnatural calm, a bastion of stability in a world gone mad. It was no longer Abner's Folly. It was the only thing that made sense. As they clawed their way up the final, steepest part of the slope, the water now a torrent at their waists, a great wooden ramp descended from the side of the vessel with a slow, deliberate groan. At the top stood Abner. He was not a figure of triumph, nor one of judgment. He was just a man, his face weathered and unreadable in the gray, failing light, holding a thick rope. He threw it down, the coiled end landing in the mud near the marshal's feet. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The simple, practical act of providing a rope was a more profound statement than any sermon on foresight or any recrimination for their foolishness could ever be. It was an offer of sanctuary, plain and simple, and they took it, one by one, their hands raw and trembling as they pulled themselves out of the roaring water and into the quiet dark of the ark. The transition from the world outside to the world within was absolute and immediate. The deafening roar of the flood was instantly muted to a distant rhythmic drumming against the thick hull. The violent churning motion of the water became a gentle, almost imperceptible rocking, a slow, cradle-like sway. The cold, driving rain was replaced by a dry, dim interior that smelled of pine sap, clean hay, and the warm, living breath of animals. Abner's livestock, the 2 mules, the cow, and her calf, the handful of goats, were secured in sturdy pens at one end of the vast, open space, their presence calm and reassuring. They looked at the strange, wet newcomers with a placid curiosity, their soft chewing sounds a counterpoint to the storm outside. The people of Providence, no more than 24 souls who had made it to the ridge, stood dripping and shivering in a silent, huddled group. They were in shock, their minds unable to process the scale of the cataclysm they had just escaped. The baker, a man whose hands were always coated in a fine layer of flour, now stood with his arms wrapped around his wife, his face streaked with mud, his eyes vacant. The blacksmith, a man of immense physical strength, trembled uncontrollably, not from the cold, but from the sheer terror of his own powerlessness against the flood. Marshal Tate, their leader, simply stood, his hat in his hands, water pooling at his feet, his gaze fixed on Abner. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer thanks, to apologize, to ask 1,000 questions, but no words came. What could be said? All of their certainty, all of their shared, comfortable mockery, lay submerged beneath 100 feet of brown water. Abner moved past them without a word. He went to a small stove he had bolted to the floor, struck a match, and soon the smell of wood smoke mingled with the other scents, and a small circle of orange light pushed back the gloom. He then brought out a stack of dry blankets, thick wool things he had stored in a sailed chest. He handed one to each person, his movements as economical and deliberate as they had been when he was building the very walls that now protected them. His silence was not an accusation, it was a form of grace. It allowed them to exist in their shame and their relief without the burden of having to articulate it. He treated their arrival not as a vindication of his beliefs, but as a practical problem to be solved. They were cold and wet, and so he provided warmth and dryness. In that moment, he was not their savior. He was simply their host. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous, gray twilight. Time was marked not by the sun, which remained hidden behind a thick, unbroken ceiling of cloud, but by the simple, repetitive routines established by their silent keeper. Abner would rise before anyone else, his movements quiet in the dim light filtering through a few high, narrow windows set just below the roof line. He would tend to the animals, milk the cow, and portion out the day's rations, dried meat, hard biscuits, and clean water from the large barrels he had secured along the hull. There was enough, he had planned for enough, but there was no excess. The food was sustenance, nothing more, and it was eaten in a somber quiet. The gentle rocking of the ark was a constant, a reminder that their entire world was now adrift. At first, the survivors spoke in hushed whispers, as if afraid to break the solemn peace of their sanctuary. They recounted fragments of their escape, the horrors they had seen, but soon even these stories faded. There was nothing left to say. Their old lives, their grievances, their ambitions, their social standings, were all gone, rendered meaningless by the water. They were all equals now, stripped down to the simple, raw fact of their survival. They would spend hours just staring out of the high windows. The view was always the same, a vast, featureless expanse of churning brown water under a gray sky. Occasionally, a piece of their former world would float by, a splendored church pew, a rooftop, an upturned wagon, and a fresh wave of quiet grief would ripple through the assembled group. They watched Abner as he worked. He moved with a purpose that seemed alien to their own stunned listlessness. He checked the seams for leaks, reinforced the animal pens, and organized the supplies with a methodical calm. He asked for nothing, and he offered no explanations. His actions were his only language. One afternoon, Marshal Tate approached him as he was inspecting the great timber beams that formed the ark's ceiling. "How did you know, Abner?" the marshal asked, his voice low. It was the question that hung unspoken in the air between all of them. Abner did not look down. He ran a hand along a massive joint, feeling the strength of his own work. "I didn't know," he said, his voice even. "Not for certain, but I listened." He paused, and for the first time, looked directly at the marshal. The earth gives signs. The animals know. The old patterns were breaking. Everyone else was too busy talking to listen to the silence in between. He then turned back to his inspection, the conversation over. It was not a boast, nor a rebuke. It was a simple statement of fact, a lesson delivered in the quiet heart of a storm, and it left the marshal with the profound and unsettling realization that wisdom was not about knowing the answers, but about paying attention to the right questions. The end of the rain came without ceremony. One morning, the relentless drumming that had been the soundtrack to their existence simply faded away, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt louder than the storm itself. A single, brilliant shaft of sunlight pierced through a high window, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing in the still air. It was a spear of light that struck them with the force of a revelation. One by one, they moved towards the windows, squinting against the unaccustomed brightness. Below them, the world was being reborn. The vast brown sea had begun to retreat, revealing the scarred and wounded landscape beneath. It was a world rendered in shades of mud. The tops of ridges and hills emerged first, like the backs of sleeping leviathans. The water level dropped with surprising speed, draining away into the saturated earth, leaving behind a thick, uniform blanket of silt that covered everything. For 2 more days the ark remained afloat, drifting slowly on the receding waters until, with a final deep groan and a gentle lurch, it settled. The motion that had been their constant companion ceased. They were on solid ground again. The silence inside the vessel was thick with anticipation and dread. What would they find outside? Abner, as always, was the first to act. He walked to the great sealed door and began to work the heavy levers that held it in place. Light flooded the interior as the massive ramp was lowered, revealing a world transformed. The air that rushed in was clean and cool, washed by the rain, but it carried a scent of decay, of wet earth and ruined things. The valley was unrecognizable. Their town was gone, buried under a sea of mud. Here and there, the broken spine of a roof or the skeletal remains of a wall jutted from the muck, tombstones for a life that no longer existed. The ark had come to rest more than a mile from the ridge where it had been built, grounded in what used to be a wide open pasture. Abner walked down the ramp, his boots sinking into the soft, deep mud. He tested the ground, his expression unreadable. He looked back at the stunned faces crowded in the doorway. "The ground is soft," he said, his voice carrying in the profound stillness. "Walk carefully." It was the most practical of warnings for the most profound of moments, their first steps back into a broken world. They descended the ramp, not as a triumphant parade of survivors, but as a somber procession of ghosts, their eyes taking in the utter desolation with a quiet, heartbreaking clarity. They stood in the mud, a small lost tribe in a silent, empty world. The sun was warm on their faces, but it brought little comfort. Before them lay the ruin of everything they had ever built, a testament to the awesome, indifferent power of the water. They looked at the mud-caked ark, the vessel that had saved them. It was no longer a folly or a miracle. It was simply a fact, a massive, undeniable object of wood and pitch that had done what it was built to do. It stood as a silent rebuke to their certainty, a monument to the wisdom they had mistaken for madness. In the days that followed, a new rhythm began. Abner, using the tools and supplies he had stored, began the slow, arduous work of creating a new beginning. He showed them how to test the ground for stability, how to salvage timbers from the wreckage, how to dig for fresh water where the flood had scoured new springs. He did not lead them as a chieftain would, but guided them as a teacher might, with patience and practical demonstration. The people of Providence, stripped of their former identities, learned to work together in a way they never had before. The baker's hands, once soft with flour, grew calloused from hauling wood. The marshal, once a symbol of law, became a master of salvage and engineering. They did not speak of the past, of their mockery. The shame was too deep, but it was a cleansing shame, one that burned away their pride and left behind a quiet, resilient humility. They no longer looked at Abner as the town eccentric, but as the man who had listened. His foresight was not a mystical gift, but the product of a deep and patient observation of the world, a connection to the rhythms of the earth they had long forgotten. He had not sought to be their savior. He had merely sought to save himself and what was his, and in doing so had created a sanctuary large enough for them all. The great ark would never float again. It would remain where it had landed, a permanent fixture in the new landscape, its hull eventually overgrown with vines, its purpose served. It was the foundation of their new community, not just physically, but spiritually. For they all now understood a truth the water had made plain, that the line between wisdom and folly is often drawn by the weather, and that sometimes the most rational thing a person can do is to build a boat on a mountain and wait for the rain.